however broken you may feel, you aren't. And that what is required is a different perspective and almost certainly a different belief system. What do you really want? I would spend quite some time actually clarifying the innermost aspirations and that inner purpose of the individual, which I think we all have. Beliefs are great, but hold them lightly. Be prepared to let them go. They're not you. They've got nothing to do with you. They're just a construct that you've placed a little bit of your identity in. What we do so easily is to use our imaginations to latch onto something that we don't want to happen and play it over and over again in our minds. And that's called anxiety.
I'm very familiar with, yes.
Most powerful tool we have as human beings is the imagination. And we are using that against ourselves to create scenarios that we don't want. Now that is a perfect definition of self-harm. Remind yourself that sense of brokenness is simply perception. It's not real. You cannot be broken.
Quick question. When did you discover that you're a leader? That your actions matter to those that look up to you? You may be an entrepreneur or an aspiring entrepreneur, innovating to change the world, or a CEO navigating a crisis, or a parent returning to work and learning to lead your career, your team, your children. There are many faces of leadership, and this is the podcast to explore them all. Welcome to Anatomy of a Leader with me, Maria Vorostovsky. I'm a headhunter and founder of HVO Search, where I help ambitious leaders hire their executive teams. My job today on this show is to help you discover your superpowers, to help you avoid making some of the same mistakes, and to remind you that even if you do, perfection doesn't and shouldn't exist. Thank you so much for listening, and please do subscribe and follow this podcast because it really helps others to discover these incredible stories. This show will challenge the way you think and may even change your life. Chris, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
So I read your book, The Broken CEO, because it really caught my attention. And the very first thing I wanted to ask you is, why this title? I mean, we think of CEOs as powerful, capable. Why broken?
Why broken, indeed. Well, I did tussle with the title because everyone I mentioned this to said, well, you mustn't use a negative title in a book. It must be positive. And I think there's a lot to be said for positive thinking, a lot. But I went with that because that's how some people feel. That's how they can feel in the depths of struggle and apparent failure. They can feel a bit broken. I know this because not only through my own experience, but certainly through having worked with a lot of CEOs and senior managers as an executive coach. They often come to me believing that they are broken and need fixing. And of course, as I say in the book, no one's broken and they don't need fixing. But that's how they present. So that was the title of the book.
So you say that nobody's broken.
No.
Is there a specific point when they come? Or have you seen any patterns as to when they end up working with you?
Yes, I think the pattern is that the old way of running their business or leading the organization just doesn't work anymore. And the more they try to push that modus operandi, the more they try to do, the less well it seems to work. And eventually they throw their hands up and say, I've got to find another way. Who do I turn to? Because clearly they're not doing it on their own.
So when you say the old way, what do you mean by that?
The old way is very often it has elements of command and control in it. An autocratic approach. Now, don't get me wrong, as I think I mentioned in the book, an autocratic leadership approach is absolutely the right one in certain circumstances, but not all circumstances. And one has to be able to adapt to the situation and to the people you're dealing with. Again, this is nothing new. This is referred to as situational leadership. But not many people are able to do it because they tend to identify with certain belief systems, and they tend to have practiced a particular way of leading that used to work but doesn't work anymore. I think people have changed. Certainly I've seen it over my lifetime. If you go back 30 or 40 years, people expected to be told what to do. And I'm generalizing hugely here. This didn't apply to everyone by any means, but a lot of people expected to be told what to do and expected to be a cog in the system, a cog in the machine. And things have changed. And you can see this particularly in the latest generation. And there's a lot of comment on this at the moment, that the latest generation, I forget which one it is, Generation Z? Gen Z, okay. I don't know what we're going to do after Z, but Gen Z it is. They're not so interested in this. They want to do what they want to do. And part of me rebels against that and says, no, they've got to fall into line. But I do get it. I absolutely get it, because one of the premises that I work on more and more is that the right way to go is to be found deeply buried in your own desires, your own aspirations, your own goals and dreams, to the point where, and I've written about this, I think perhaps somewhere else, that what you really want to do, with the emphasis on really, is probably the best guiding light for your life and today. What do you really want to do? Because I think we can very easily suffocate that and suppress it and replace it with, well, what should I do? What ought I to do today? What would my parents expect me to do? What would my boss expect me to do? And all of that is a frame of reference beyond yourself. It's all out there. But within you, I think within each of us, there is desire to go down a certain path, to explore certain things, to achieve certain things. And I think the more we can connect with that, the more in tune we'll be with the world outside. And in relation to Gen Z, I think that they are more in tune than that, with that guiding light, that inner guiding light, than perhaps I was at the same stage.
And why do you think that is? Because that's certainly the case. I mean, this questions like, what do I want, is much more common in the generation than in the previous ones. Yeah. Is it because the parents have been asking the children? Is it because, there's a cultural movement? Like, where is this coming from?
I think it's all of those. I think there's an evolution in mankind that demands it. It's also heavily supported by technology, because we don't need to worry about where our next meal is coming from. That's a lot of that is taken care of. So Maslow's pyramid, the bottom two layers of that, they are far more robust than they were not so long ago. And I think people now rightly have the luxury to say, well, I'm not going to worry too much about where I'm going to get my next meal from. I'm going to do what I want.
Going back just to the CEOs that you end up working with, is there a pattern in the sense that, they've realized that actually I'm not in the place where I'm supposed to be because this isn't necessarily what I wanted, and then trying to unpack where these things have come from?
Yes.
And what is that?
Yeah. I think in the case of entrepreneurs, let's take that as an example. Entrepreneurs start their entrepreneurial life, hopefully, full of energy, full of hope, full of vision, purpose, and that buzz they create attracts others to them. And they get things going. And I have a few people like this that I know where they're running very, very energetic and thriving businesses. But sooner or later, inevitably, they, at least the people I work with, they hit the buffers because they expect the business to grow and to change, but they don't necessarily expect or entertain the possibility that they might have to change radically and grow into the new business. So, a pretty obvious example of this, which I highlight in the book, is where a CEO will grow their enterprise to a certain point very often through the capacity of their intellects and their energy. If they can do it and they can keep tabs on everything that's going on, and they can do it fairly autocratically as well, fairly command and control, micromanaging. They know what's going on. But eventually they get to the point where they just can't keep tabs on everything anymore. So they're faced with a decision. They may not see it like this, but there is a decision to be made. Do I carry on like this, struggling with this business that has grown around me and just try harder and harder and harder? Or do I let go and allow other people the wherewithal and the delegation to take on all the responsibilities that I've been holding to myself? So there's a point at which they need to let go. And that's a very, very critical point. That's a make or break point. A lot of private equity investors recognize this phenomenon very clearly and will quite ruthlessly take the originating entrepreneur out of the business and stick a professional manager in instead.
Yeah.
And that can be very difficult for the individual as well.
Mm. In your book, you said leadership is often about doing less rather than more. What did you mean by that?
Yeah. I think doing more in the face of difficulties can make the difficulties worse. So, for instance, if you've got an employee who is not doing what you want them to do, it's a very common reaction to start to put pressure on them, start to performance manage them, start to scrutinize their every activity, and that can be extremely counterproductive. And again, this isn't rocket science. This is obvious. We've all seen this in operation. The questions that people need to be asking when somebody isn't performing is there something that they would be much better suited to be doing? Is this the right place for them? And there ought to be ongoing conversations around that to see what can be done. Now, if somebody isn't performing in a role, there are two ways to go. You can either train them or you can move them to another role. And that other role might be beyond the confines of the organization. In other words, it's a termination of contract. But that's fine too, providing it's done in a compassionate way where the best interests of all concerned are taken into account. That's a perfectly valid thing to do. Now, I see a lot of CEOs desperately trying to avoid that particular action because they don't want to be someone that sacks an employee. They don't like it. The problem with avoiding that action is that it just creates more and more difficulty down the line for the whole organization. Mm-hmm. And the higher the level of the individual in the hierarchy is, the more trouble it creates.
Actually, what's interesting is that out of the CEOs that I interview, pretty much the top 3 regrets they have is not letting go of someone sooner.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a quote from a guy that used to run part of Microsoft, a big chunk, and it goes something like, it's better to have a hole in your team than an a-hole in your team, which kind of says it as it is. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very, very true. the wrong person in the team, and I've seen this so many times, can cause so much damage. And it erodes the culture within the team, and that spreads beyond the team itself to, potentially the whole organization. And all that I say, I don't underestimate it, but what needs to be done was that person needs to be moved out of the organization. And I actually, in the last few years, I've done a number of interim management roles as an interim general manager or CEO. And essentially, the core of what I've had to do is to remove people that the current management didn't want to do. They agreed it needed to be done, but they couldn't bring themselves to do it.
I suppose it's easier for someone external to come in and do that, as opposed to having to do that yourself when you've built some sort of bonds.
Yeah.
And I think one of the challenges of leadership is being able to separate yourself to some extent as a person who has a relationship versus a leader of that specific business, and having to make the decisions that are for the business's greater good.
Indeed. But what I think you can take that one step further, that if it's in the business's greatest good, it will also be in the individual's greatest good. Mm-hmm. You cannot, I haven't seen a relationship where one party benefits and the other doesn't. I don't think they exist. If someone is in the wrong place, it's wrong for both parties, not just for them. Mm-hmm. And this is the bit that some leaders miss because they don't see that bigger picture. And that's very often compounded by a wish to be liked. They don't want to be seen to be the bogeyman and all of that. They enjoy the good relationships they've got. But in the end, that will work against you.
Mm. And going to that point about wanting to be liked, what do you see, how does that play out in the broken CEO? Because that also has to come from somewhere. Yes,
well, that probably like many psychological patterns can be created in childhood. My work as an executive coach isn't to get into kind of therapist role and identify that. But I don't think it needs to be identified. I think it needs to be acknowledged and then put to one side. But the need to be liked, it's a very powerful thing, isn't it? And if it's allowed to filter into every relationship, what it can do is to undermine the authenticity and the trust of that relationship. Well, initially the authenticity, because you're not actually communicating what you feel to the other person. You're inevitably, you're telling them what you think they want to hear.
Mm. So we're talking about understanding an individual, where they're good at, what they're not good at, from a leadership perspective of, potentially letting them go. What if the leader themselves need to go through that process to understand, talking about, something's not working out and I'm just trying harder and harder. How do you go through that process to realize that, do you need to be in a different role, for example?
Right, yeah, very good question, that. And it comes back to the principle of, what do you really want? So I would spend quite some time actually clarifying the innermost aspirations and, if you like, the purpose, that inner purpose of the individual, which I think we all have. I think there's that all of us have some little spark that we want to express in some way. Many of us are not, for whatever reason, not able to express it fully. In the case of some CEOs, they're not expressing it at all. And the right thing to do is for them to go off and do something else. But that requires, quite a little bit of reflection and soul searching before we get to that point. But it does happen, yeah.
I'd like to explore what your definition of a leader is.
I think a leader is someone that can excite people to do things they didn't even think they could do. I think that's what it boils down to. Good things, obviously.
Yes.
Although there are plenty of examples in history of the other. But yeah, it's about inspiring other people, and it's not so much through an intentional inspiration. It's just through the buzz that you give off with your ideas. And I remember this very well as a young, in my early 20s. I joined a startup in Cambridge, run by 3 ex-Cambridge PhD students, super bright, very ambitious. And I remember I was in the lab working until I was an engineer in those days, working till maybe 2 a.m. Regularly, because I just loved everything about it, and I loved the work that I was doing, and I could only get to work on it because of the environment that those people, those founders, had created. So I think another very important aspect of leadership is that of creating the right environment for people to thrive. And that's exactly what they did through their ideas, through the resources that they gave me, through the trust that they put in me. And that leads on to another interesting thing, I think, which I don't know if I mentioned it in the book, but it's certainly in one of my leadership programs. And that is the idea of a leader as a gardener. So the organization as a garden. And that contrasts greatly with other well-known metaphors for organizations. You know, there's the machine metaphor for an organization, which I think can be quite destructive, because then everyone becomes a cog in a well-oiled machine. The other one is the military metaphor, but then you're out to beat someone else. You know, there's a heavy element of competition, as there is in the sporting metaphor. But with the gardening metaphor, the beauty of it is that there's no competition in it. You're just out to be the best you can be. And you allow the plants to do their own thing. You plant a seed in the full knowledge that that seed has all the intelligence it needs to grow into a beautiful bush or flower. You know, an acorn, which is a big seed, but it's not that big, that can grow into an enormous oak. And everything it needs to know to do that is in that one seed. So if you compare the flowers to people in an organization, if you've got the right people there, you don't need to be telling them what to do all the time. In fact, Steve Jobs said, we don't hire good people to tell them what to do. We hire good people to tell us what to do, which is the right way around. And it comes down to the other point of that we should all be looking to hire the very best people we can find, and people that are better than us in certain departments. So the garden is just a couple more words on the garden. The gardener, all the gardener does is to make the environment conducive to the best possible growth. And the gardener does that purely, in fact, by paying attention to the 4 elements. Fire, which is light, obviously they've got to have light. Water, earth, and air. And the gardener's prime focus is on creating that environment out of those 4 elements so that the plants can thrive. And I think there's a lot to be said for organizations, for leaders to treat organizations in that way. Fortunately, I'm not alone. The very famous American general, Stanley McChrystal, says pretty much exactly the same thing, that the garden metaphor is the optimal one for organizational leadership.
I like that very much in terms of allowing the seeds to express themselves and, you know, providing the right conditions, the soil, the sunlight, the water to be able for them to really flourish
Yeah.
and to thrive. I suppose also there's the element of pruning that's required to allow the good seeds to come through, which is what we were talking about earlier too.
Yes.
And what would you say is the number one quality for an effective leader? What's the most essential?
Well, I could borrow a quote from Colin Powell, the chief of staff way back in, I don't know which American president it was, but a highly decorated soldier who was asked that question in a press conference. And without hesitation, he said, trust. And I don't think there's much more that you can say about it. I think trust underlines and it creates the foundation for relationships. If you have no trust, you can't have a relationship at all. If you take trust out of society, society breaks down instantly. You have to have trust. The challenge is to recognize that that trust is not just about the other person's behavior. The essence of it is held by both parties. So I have to trust in myself and I have to trust in the other person. And I have to be very careful about judging the trustworthiness of the other person. And I think the starting point needs to always to be full trust until it's proved otherwise. Because if you go into a relationship without trust, then it will skew it very, very quickly. It's a bit like, coming back to the garden metaphor, it's a little bit like planting a seed, allowing it to germinate, and then digging it up to find out how it's getting on. That doesn't work.
No.
So, yeah, I would say trust. There are certain things that's necessary, fundamentally necessary, but not sufficient. There are other things that you need, and probably the most important of those would be vision. The leader's vision is the thing that galvanizes the leader and everyone around them into action. And they have to hold the vision. And in fact, I tell people, look, if there's anyone around you that has a clearer and more powerful vision of where you're going than you do, you need to hand over to them immediately because they need to be the leader. So in other words, make sure that your vision, that you are really on top of your vision and that it resonates for you and inspires you and hence inspires everyone around you.
I think vision is the most quoted quality that I have discovered in this podcast. I feel that has been almost mentioned by everyone, maybe with one or two exceptions. But I thought you were going to say self-awareness.
Well, I can say more about that.
Because for me,
With
unless
pleasure.
you really understand yourself, it's very then difficult to understand other people and how societies kind of form in general.
It is. But there are levels of self-awareness. And there's the self-awareness in the sense of the psychological tests and the kind of makeup of one's character and personality. And that's necessary, but it doesn't stop there. It goes well beyond that because our personalities and our egos are only a small part of who we are in reality. And it really is incumbent on the leader to be aware of the inner workings of their minds at all times. And this is where mindfulness comes in. And mindfulness has been hijacked by all kinds of commercial concerns these days and is generally thought to be listening to a meditation app or something like that. Unfortunately and inconveniently, it's not like that at all. It really comes down to a a profound awareness in every moment of one's own inner dynamics, and one's own inner dynamics being influenced constantly by everything around, perceptions that are coming in. And for me, that focus on the present moment is greatly helped by the understanding that there actually is no such thing as time. Time is, as Einstein said, a stubborn illusion. It doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And we can get a sense of it not existing by realizing that there is no past and there is no future. And I use those words very carefully. There was a past and there will be a future, but there is no past. And what we tend to do so easily is to drag what we think is the past into the present and allow it to pollute and dilute the fullness of the present moment. And we, through what we miss as a result, we tend to start struggling and end up feeling broken. The past, what we do so easily is to mistake the past, which has no existence whatsoever, with a memory of the past, which is something completely different. And we attribute reality and currency to the past when it cannot have any, or rather to the memory of the past when the memory cannot be and is not the past. It's just an artifact of it.
I'm a huge believer in that as well, in the sense that there is no time. But when we live in our current Western world, where deadlines are a thing, where the calendar, the new holidays, like everything is measured in how many days or how many seconds things take. So to some extent, it's a human construct that we have imposed upon ourselves and have somehow found ourselves almost stuck within it, because in order for us to process the infinity of time and our own existence, it's very difficult to not find some kind of solace in the structure of time.
Yes, and this is where the true practice of mindfulness comes into play, is a constant reminder to oneself that there is only this moment and that nothing else exists. Absolutely, we have the option to delve into our memories, and that's very important, for basic survival purposes. We need to be, I wouldn't have got here today without my memory. We need that, but we don't have to live in it. Similarly, and there's a very good example of using the other end of the spectrum, the future. We tend to use our imaginations. Imagination and memory are closely linked, but memory tends to be more fixed. Imagination is fluid. And we can do what we like in our imaginations. We can create anything we like. But what tends to happen, and in fact, as I point out in the book, everything in this room, everything around us, apart from those things that are living, the flowers and the people, everything is an output of the human imagination over thousands of years to get us here. But what we do so easily is to use our imaginations to latch onto something that we don't want to happen and play it over and over again in our minds. And that's called anxiety.
I'm very familiar with, yes.
So we're using our most powerful tool. Most powerful tool we have at our disposal as human beings is the imagination. And we are using that against ourselves to create scenarios that we don't want.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that is a perfect definition of self-harm. And ultimately, if you do it enough, I've read plenty of papers suggesting that, or not suggesting, but showing evidence that will ultimately lead to various forms of mental ill health.
I have only recently started to really notice the effects of stress and how we almost create our own negativity, and then that leads to disease and illness. It's funny that I'm coughing at the same time that I'm saying that, but that's a fast. And I think you mentioned quite a lot of studies in your book as well with regards to what happens when we are stressed, and the consequences of that on
well, yes. I mean, the both our mental bodies and our physical body are inextricably intertwined. I don't think Descartes did us any favors by suggesting that they were completely separate. I believe it was Descartes that came up with the mind-body division. Interestingly, in Eastern philosophy, they make no distinction at all between the two, because they are so closely connected to each other. So from that point of view, it's no surprise that if you allow any kind of mental self-abuse or self-harm to persist, ultimately it's going to show up in one's emotional body, and then ultimately in your physical body. And this isn't woo-woo stuff. There are some pretty rigorous papers written on the subject showing a direct link between certain forms of physical illness and chronic stress, chronic anxiety.
No, I'm a huge believer in that, and you can really see it too. And I think as we age as well, and that accumulates, and you also begin to realize what we're talking about, who am I doing this for? Is it for me or is it for someone else? And all of a sudden, as you get to that stage where you are beginning to step into more senior positions, or having to then either step into CEO or sort of senior managers, all of that begins to accumulate as well. So I just find that fascinating, and how it becomes even more important to really focus on your internal state.
Yes.
But what just got me thinking in terms of in the West we have this separation between sort of the mind and the body, and then the Eastern philosophies don't. And arguably kind of our Western world is setting the standard in terms of how businesses should be run, what's effective, what's not. And this idea, especially not so recent past, that the emotion, the mental state has no place in the workplace or in the boardroom. How you are one person at home where you can show your vulnerabilities, and how you're a different person. Turn up, you put your suit on, do your hair, do whatever it takes, and then you come in presented with a face that you show the better sides of you, or strength and sort of infallibility is what's required. What are your thoughts on that? Like keeping emotions out of the boardroom?
Well, great question. I was speaking just last week to a senior female leader in a large American corporation, who's coming to the end of a program that I've run for her. And she said that she was hugely relieved after decades of doing exactly what you've just described, of putting this face on, and eschewing her emotional side, in the pursuit of emulating the male leaders that are in the organization. She suddenly realized that not only is it not necessary, but it's not particularly good thing either. And she's felt a huge sense of relief at the removal of that requirement, which she placed on herself. Nobody else did it for her. She looked at the situation and clearly decided, perhaps subconsciously, perhaps not even consciously, that she needed to adopt these behaviors, and she needed to to keep her emotions and her feelings out of the equation altogether. And it was tough for her to do because that's not her, and we're not talking about wearing your emotions on your sleeves all the time and externalizing everything that you feel. It's not about that at all, but it is about acknowledging everything that you are. And I think what changed her understanding of this was something that I'm pretty sure is mentioned in the book. And that's the work of a neurologist back in the 80s or 90s, who demonstrated through a series of meta-studies that injuries to the brain that resulted in a lack of feeling in the individual meant that not only could they not feel, but they couldn't make decisions either. Now, that was a big eye-opener for me, because as an engineer, I imagined for the first part of my career that logic was everything, and that organizations needed to be the kind of well-oiled machine that I was designing, and that anything else wouldn't work properly. Well, well-oiled machine organizations don't work properly either, as I discovered. And then I came across this particular evidence, which I think was first published, or may have been published, in Daniel Goleman's book on emotional intelligence. And that was unequivocal proof that you make decisions on the basis of how you feel, not how you think. Now, that's not to say you don't need to think. It's not to say you don't need to do your homework, do your analysis and all of that. You do need to do that, but all that does is change the way that you feel towards the issue at hand. If you remove that feeling, you will have no decisions, to the point where you can't even decide which restaurant to go to.
I remember reading a study, and I don't know if it's the same one, and it was a case study about a woman who was probably in a car accident, but she had some extensive brain damage that allowed her to have all the faculties. She could walk, she could speak, and the part of her brain that was damaged was her emotional center. And they were monitoring this woman to understand what will happen to her. And she could not make decisions. She would go to a supermarket and she could literally not choose which cereal to buy because it was so inextricably linked to her ability to make that decision. When I came across that, it's like, emotions have a bad rep, and emotions are quite frequently also attributed to women, whereas we all experience them. It's just how perhaps they are expressed may be slightly different, but how important emotions are in our biological bodies that govern everything that we do. And this is my point about this division between the emotions or the mind and the body itself, and they're completely linked.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes, I think this was a big breakthrough for me. It was certainly a breakthrough for this woman, my client, and I have absolutely no doubt that her style of leadership will change radically as a result. Just knowing that and giving herself permission to be all that she is, not just a chunk of her that she thinks is acceptable to the organization. And if that then makes her incompatible with the organization, that doesn't matter. The most important thing is that she's being compatible with herself.
I mean, this is it, isn't it? Where there's part of self-awareness and self-understanding in terms of what you're good at, what your strengths are, what you enjoy, what you don't enjoy, and trying to find a way of matching that with the company that you go and work with. And I think that's the magic. And in the past, where people were expected to work, in the same company until they retired, versus now, I think Simon Sinek the other day was talking about how, Generation Z, expected to jump from one job to another every year. Not that I necessarily think that that's a good idea either, but this idea that we have a lot more options, at least in our kind of immediate Western, world, where you do not have to stick with the same place. You can find somewhere which resonates more with your values and your skills. You just need to assess and understand them first.
Yeah.
And also not be afraid to say, actually, this is not a place for me, and to find something that fits better.
Yes, absolutely.
Do you think that it is expected more now to be more transparent, more human, so to speak, as a leader?
Yes, without doubt. Now, this brings in a very interesting, very topical debate at the moment about vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
And I've given this some thought and reflection. I've read quite a lot about it. And I find myself reacting against the idea of vulnerability, simply because, well, the meaning of it. It means to be open to being wounded.
Right.
Be open to wounding.
Is that how we perceive vulnerability as well? As in, when I say we, do you feel that's an accurate description of what people mean by vulnerability, visible vulnerability in, as a leader, for example?
What I suspect is that we are conflating vulnerability with authenticity.
I see.
Authenticity, if you look at the root of that, that's all about self-reference. The auto is self, and it's about being complete within oneself, which leads into integrity. But vulnerability is, I think, within oneself, one needs to be vulnerable in the sense that one needs to acknowledge what's going on and the impact it's having on one, and integrate that into who you are, and not deny it, push it away, and sweep it under the carpet. But I'm not a fan of externalizing our emotions on a real-time basis. And I don't think that's really what people want from their leaders. I think what people want from their leaders are those that can stand firm when the going gets tough. Or as Colin Powell said, look bright and energetic when you're feeling tired and want to go to sleep. Look satisfied when you're feeling hungry. All of those things. You need to present almost an ideal, and that's part of the vision. A vision is always an ideal. It's a dream. It may manifest, but the chances are it'll manifest in a different way from the dream that you're holding, or that your dream will adapt as time passes. But it's an ideal. Mm. And I think leaders have to represent an ideal. And if you look at the great leaders of I won't say the 21st century, but certainly the 20th century, I think they had a vision. They knew what they wanted, and they stood firm. And they did not appear, to me anyway, to be particularly vulnerable, other than some of them getting assassinated. But that's a different thing.
Talking about representing the ideal, and I wonder if the ideal has changed as well, because through anecdotal stories of, for example, we had someone on the show who was talking about, a CEO or a senior leader that she was working with who was going through something really difficult. And she encouraged him to come forward and to talk about that. So to some extent be vulnerable and expose some of his weaknesses and, showing this is how he went through the situation. And as a result, the team was so grateful for him kind of explaining that situation and showing his vulnerability and showing that he's more of a human being and much more relatable. And as a result, the team camaraderie and the respect for this person increased.
Okay, but was that done in retrospect, or was that done in the moment?
I don't know. I think it was done in the moment.
So Was he externalizing his perceived weakness within himself as it manifested?
I'm not sure if it was perceived as a weakness, because I think it was an external event that happened.
Right.
It was less about, oh, I did this mistake and this is how I've arrived to it. I think it was a personal situation that happened to him that has made him feel emotional, distressed, upset.
But I would be all for relating that as an example of how one approaches adversity. But to do it at the time in the moment as it's unfolding, and to be externalizing the perhaps the indecision, the anxiety, and saying to everyone, look, this is a terrible situation and I don't know how to deal with it. I would find that potentially destabilizing within a team.
Mm.
If they were to say, I don't know how to deal with it, but we're going to find a way through, that's another matter. But there again, she's holding the vision. We're going to get through. That's the important bit. And that's not vulnerable.
So do leaders always have to have the answer?
No, absolutely not. And I tell many, many of my people, one of the best things you can say is, I don't know. Particularly when people start relying on you for having answers. Mm-hmm. I don't know. You go and find out.
It was ask Uncle Google.
Yeah, or whatever. And there are various stages of coaching, where I think I describe in the book, where you take people through it's a bit of a process, I suppose, in order to make them more self-reference, self-reliant, mm-hmm. Finding the answer from within, or at least finding the answer on their own. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a place for discussion and finding answers collectively. But very often people can become over-reliant on someone who has all the answers. Mm-hmm. And no one has all the answers. And I don't know, either to the group of people you're leading, or the same phrase, I don't know, to yourself, can be immensely liberating. Because we don't know, particularly today, that this whole time that we're living through is characterized by the acronym that I mentioned in the book, VUCA. Mm-hmm. There's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity all around us. You don't deal with that by pretending to know.
After reading your book, I wrote a post on LinkedIn, because at the same time as reading a book, I was watching Gabby Dollhouse, and you probably don't know what it is because your kids are not toddlers.
Right.
It's a children's TV show, and it was like 5:45 in the morning, and my kids were watching while I was sort of trying to have like a quick nap at that time in the morning. And I just heard this, her saying, it's like, I don't know yet. And it really woke me up. And I guess it just connected the two things together. And it is such a powerful thing to say, because first of all, if you already have the answer, there is no curiosity.
Yes.
There is no other way of looking at a problem. There's no relying on other people. Like, why have a team if you can't rely on them or ask for their opinions? Why only consult your own very, very biased view? You need to have that diversity of thought. And if you're constraining yourself by having all the answers, you're really not seeing, you have your blind spots. And I just thought that was really powerful. And the fact that she added yet at the end, I thought that was good, at least from a lesson to the kids, in terms of, well, you don't have to have the answers, but you can be curious enough to find that out.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And not knowing is divergent. It opens up infinite possibilities.
I guess it's like being bored as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where you need that, and going back to the sort of the mindfulness of sort of sitting in the discomfort either of not knowing or sitting in the discomfort of I don't have anything to do, where you have to sort of let things come to you, or to take the time, for the answer to kind of float up, or for you to have it, connect the dots in a different way.
Yes. And that's right. And that's a living process. Whereas just plucking an answer or a belief system, because they're the same thing, and applying that to whatever's in front of you is a very dead process. It's very algorithmic. And that's why I find it interesting, the big debate about theism, atheism, and agnosticism. I find that in essence, there is no difference between the believer and the non-believer.
Really? In what way?
Well, because they both believe in something.
Right.
Right? The atheist believes in what they believe in, a non-existence of a deity. The believers believe in a deity, but they're both belief systems. The agnostic, who sits in the middle, or maybe up here or down there, doesn't believe anything at all, because they say, I don't know. The evidence that I have is not sufficient for me to say one or the other. And that's where I like to sit, and I like to be comfortable there as far as I can in not knowing. Now, this irritates my wife sometimes because she accuses me of sitting on the fence. But as long as you've got a pillow to sit on, you can see both sides, and you can see much further.
It's true. And you can begin to formulate your opinion on more evidence, as opposed to just polarizing yourself into one or the other.
Now, beliefs are great, but hold them lightly. Be prepared to let them go. They're not you. They've got nothing to do with you. They're just a construct that you've perhaps placed a little bit of your identity in. But let them go. Now, another thing that characterizes the present time is a polarization of view. We can see this all around us at a micro level, at a global level. Opinions are polarized, and people are massing at one pole or the other in order to fight the other.
This, you're talking about that when the timing is really right for this as well, because for me, it feels like that's what starts conflict so much.
Oh, yeah.
And the media has a lot to say in this, because it is beneficial for them to polarize people into one camp or the other. And, talking about, social media or posting any kind of controversial topics to try to get attention, because it does get attention.
Yes.
Because, people feel so passionate about one or the other. But I think for me, the danger is when there is no debate any longer, where it's like, well, that's my belief and that's your belief, and there is no way to find a third perspective or come in the middle, or to change them altogether. And I feel like that's quite dangerous.
Oh, terribly dangerous. Terribly dangerous. In fact, we live in dangerous times at the moment. And yes, you're absolutely right. That's what it is. And it's all because we believe that it is right to hold strong opinions. And actually, it really isn't that necessary, and it really isn't that helpful, because we are not our opinions. We're human beings. The life behind the opinion is far more important than whatever opinion you happen to be holding. And I think one of the reasons that we get stuck in this is because we invest our identity in those belief systems. And when you do that, they become part of you. They're very difficult to extricate. So that when somebody challenges that opinion, they're challenging you, not the opinion, they're challenging you, and that becomes an existential threat, even at a subconscious level. That's really threatening. So what do? You fight tooth and nail. So yeah, it is very dangerous. It's very well documented in Eastern philosophy. in terms of the mind being comprising 4 elements. One element is memory, one is intellect, and the other is identity, which you might call ego, but it's loosely ego. So you've got memory, identity, and intellect. And the intellect is like a sharp knife. It's able to dissect, to analyze, to cut open. So it can cause harm. And, we talk about people having a razor-sharp intellect or a rapier-like mind. We've got that. We've got the belief system. The belief system is held in memory. So it's not present. It's something in the past. And in terms of what we were discussing earlier, it has no real existence.
Mm-hmm.
But because we are identifying with that belief system held in memory, the job of the intellect is to defend that. And so we see some very good examples of very fine intellects defending to the hilt their belief systems and attempting to do great damage to anyone else's belief system. Those are only 3 of the aspects of mind in the Eastern system. The 4th aspect is that of intelligence. Now, intelligence is not intellect. It's much, much more than that. Intellect can only operate on memory, on data in memory, which is by definition of the past. Because as soon as something is in memory, it's already happened.
Mm-hmm.
It's gone in reality. So those 3 aspects of mind do not exist in the present moment. The only one that does is the intelligence. And that's a far, far greater concept altogether, and has both individual and collective aspects to it. I'll go on at great length, probably, but best not to here. But the point being that we are using our minds in a very, very limited way when we get into those kinds of division of belief.
Mm-hmm. What advice would you have for CEOs, leaders, entrepreneurs when they do feel broken?
Well, read the book is the first one. Remind yourself that sense of brokenness is simply a perception. It's not real. You cannot be broken. That existential, all-encompassing sense of being can't be broken. And I know that from personal experience and from working with a lot of other people as well. So, however broken you may feel, you aren't. And that what is required is a different perspective and almost certainly a different belief system, or rather a lack of belief system. There is generally a need to weaken the link between belief and the individual. Because a lot of the people I work with suffer from believing things which in essence are not true.
Where can people find you?
They can find me online if you Google Chris Pearse, Pearse with an S. If you Google the Broken CEO, my website is chrispearse.co.uk. That's a good place to find me. But it's Pearse with an S, so it's not the usual English spelling.
Chris, thank you so much for coming onto the show. Such a pleasure to talk to you and just fascinating to hear your insights and perspectives. So thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure, Maria, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me here on Anatomy of a Leader. What did you discover in this episode? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments on YouTube or reviews on Apple Podcasts. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe or follow buttons, and I'll see you next week.